We're back here on the platform and speaking with Wayne Neely, who is a meteorologist. Godfrey?
Mr. Neely, it seems as if you didn't mention too much about the royal governors because the Bahamas was a colony at the time. What role did the British government play in terms of assisting in the relief efforts?
Well, the King of England at the time, first of all, he sent a sympathy message out to the persons in it, and then they provided some aid, but not significantly much. Don't forget, because in 1929, it was like a perfect storm. You had the 1929 storm, but right after the 1929 hurricane, you also had the Great Depression.
Economic depression.
Depression throughout the world. So basically, the Bahamas at the time couldn't get help from persons within the region or the United States, or in fact, Europe at the time as well.
So we had to rebuild
by our own. Yes.
By our own.
And many churches, for example, many today would keep programs, what they call programs at the time, and have fundraising events to put the churches back in some normalcy. Under other hurricanes, like the 1866 hurricane, the great governor of England basically provided aid to the thing, but that didn't happen in this storm. Not on a significant level.
One of the reasons, Mr. Neely, why these storms, they caught Bahamian unawares was because you didn't have forecasting equipment.
No, we didn't. There was no Met Office at the time.
No Met Office. And all modern forecasting methods involve observation of current conditions, along with historical data.
Yes.
So you watch the movement of animals.
Animals, yeah. One of the things they watch the seabirds coming in from before hurricane. Birds sort of like have a sixth sense when it comes to hurricanes, and I guess the same thing they experienced with the tsunami in Southeast Asia several years back. Most of the local persons said that whenever there was a storm coming, they would watch the seabirds. The seabirds would make their way back into the mainland in droves. You can actually see them traveling in great numbers back to the mainland to protect themselves from the storm, and they would watch that. And once they know that, they'd have some kind of idea that maybe there's some kind of bad weather that's approaching the island. So,
but didn't the commissioners, for example, have mercury machines to determine?
Yeah, they had a barometer. Every island commissioner had a barometer.
Yeah.
And for the island of Andros, it was stationed at Mango Key. And what the commissioner did, once he noticed a steep drop in pressure that's caused by the hurricane, he would then take it upon himself to go and warn the residents throughout the community about an impending storm. And many of the islands...
That's only hours, though.
Yeah, it's only hours. And that's the reason why the death toll was so high. In this hurricane, 134 Bahamians died in that. A lot of them were sponge fishermen at the time. So
they were out at sea?
Yeah, they were out at sea, not knowing the storm. And they would take with them a barometer. And once they noticed a steep drop in pressure, they would try to make their way back to land. But sometimes they notice it too late, and by the time they before they get to land, the storm would catch with them.
Blind Blake wrote about it.
Yes. Run Come See Jerusalem.
Run
Yes,
Come
I have
See Jerusalem.
Yes.
And he talked about the number of
boats that were traveling from. One of them was the Pretoria.
Yes.
He was talking about Pretoria, the Ethel, the Myrtle, and Pretoria. The Pretoria was actually an actual boat that was traveling from Nassau to Andros.
With passengers
on board, yes. And 27 persons died, and only 3 persons survived. Those were York Newton, I think, of Blanket Sang, Henry Brown, and another chap. And they were able to swim into the mainland. Those are the only 3 that survived, and they called them the Lucky Tree at the time.
And he named his Run Come See
Jerusalem, yes.
Because of the number of bodies that were floating in the waters.
He also said that this wind blew up in the northwest. Was that geographically correct?
Yeah, well, it depends on the location of the storm at the time, because it's a circular storm. But I think the winds were from the north and the northeast, and that's one of the reasons why you had, because the winds were so strong, and it was a very compact storm, and it was extremely.
And it was wet.
And it was wet, yeah, extremely wet, yeah. And most of for example, some of the persons who I interviewed in Nassau said the water on the streets of New Providence is up to 4 feet, and some areas they use a dinghy boat to get around the streets of Nassau. So it was a really wet storm, and
was this the worst storm we ever had? Was it as bad as the
20s? Well, you had one.
26 was pretty bad, especially in the southeastern.
In the southeast Bahamas, right? Yeah, that's correct. And this one was bad because it impacted it impacted the capital, and it decimated the sponge. Back then, sponging was the #1 industry in the Bahamas, and 336 sponge vessels were destroyed in this hurricane. So that basically just wiped out the entire sponging fleet.
Yeah. So 29 hurricane was worse than the 26 hurricane.
I would say no.
No? 26 was worse?
26 hurricane, yeah, you had 258 persons died in the 26 hurricane. This one you only had 134, but this was bad because this lasted for 3 days over New Providence. This is the last storm that actually impacted New Providence from then to now.
Yeah, but in terms of damage to infrastructure,
Right.
Yes.
Right.
29 was worse.
Worse, yes, it
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
Yes.
But loss of life is
Loss of life was
26.
Yes,
1926.
26, yeah, that's correct.
And so since 29, we've not had a hurricane as bad as 29 or 26.
No, we haven't. And
Okay.
we overdue for one.
You know, we're not.
My sister will tell me she rebuked me in the name of Jesus.
Yes, absolutely. We rebuke you. We go pray for you, boy. In 1866,
66. Yes.
there was a very
That was
bad
worse, yeah,
hurricane.
that was bad, yes.
That was the worst hurricane in the history of the Bahamas.
That and the 1899 hurricanes.
Yes.
Those two, yes, they are.
What made them worse?
They destroyed the whole country was devastated in the 1860 and 1899 hurricane. And it also, the 1899 hurricane wiped out the sponge fleet. 334 Bahamians died in that one. And the 1866, you had 387. And a lot of the houses were destroyed, so basically didn't have any means to rebuild. And many months after that, a lot of persons were starved because it destroyed the farms. Back then, farming was a big thing, and it wiped out the entire farms throughout the country.
And many people
Yes.
starved.
Yes, and in this one, the 1929, you only had the Northwest Bahamas affected. The Central and Southeast Bahamas were relatively unscathed.
Tell me, prior to, how far back in the 1800s do you go with these hurricanes?
Well, I've researched every single hurricane that impacted the Bahamas from the time Christopher Columbus and founded one here up to the present day ones. So I go all the way back to 1500.
Because I actually remember one in 1815.
Yes. And I think I did find some information on it. Yeah.
So you are a hurricane expert.
Well, I wouldn't say expert, but I try my best to research as much about hurricanes as possible. And when the national, it's gotten to such an extent now that the National Hurricane Center in the United States, which is the governing body for hurricanes here in the region and hurricanes worldwide, whenever they're dealing with a hurricane, either in the Bahamas or whether they're dealing with hurricanes in the region, they actually consult me before they do anything.
Have you been lecturing
Yes.
on this?
Yes.
Where? have
Many
you been?
universities. I've been to MIT, I've been to Penn State, I've been to Ohio State, I've been to the University of Florida International University. And Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and Jeopardy actually called me for hurricane questions in terms of for hurricanes, when they have a hurricane question or when they have a science question.
So you're a global expert on hurricanes.
No, I would say a global expert.
Got to be.
I try my best to research them as much as possible for the greater good of the Bahamas.
Tell me, what is the difference between a meteorologist and a climatologist?
Well, climatologist compiles records that are for example, a meteorologist goes there, he reads the temperature, he reads the atmospheric pressure, and he keeps that record for a month, and after a month he sends that to the climatological section, which compiles that record. So, for example, if you want to know what the weather will be like, what the weather was about 100 years ago, that's the job of the climatologist: compile that record, store it, and keep it in a usable manner until it's needed or required.
Mm-hmm. I noticed in your book you mentioned the many islands of the Caribbean.
Yes.
And the 29 hurricane came through those Caribbean islands,
Yes.
right? Did they have the kind of devastation that we had in the Bahamas?
Yeah, worse. In some cases, it was worse. The same problem we experienced in the Bahamas, the same problems they experienced down there. For example, this hurricane, like the hurricane I'm writing on now, the 1928 hurricane, I think 3,000 persons died in Puerto Rico, and that was like a normal figure. Probably like several thousand persons died in the average storm, especially if it was a strong storm.
Mm-hmm. So the 29 hurricane would have stayed over some of those islands for a couple of days as well?
No, just it moved very quickly. It stayed. What happened is that when the hurricane was coming, there was a high pressure to the north of it, and
Push it down?
there was two high pressures. It was like stuck between two high pressure systems, and that basically kept it stationary until one of the storms were able to move to the northeast side of the area, and it gave hurricane a place to actually go.
So in the case of the Bahamas, it stayed over New Providence, the northwest Bahamas.
Yes.
Which is Andros and New
New
Providence.
Providence and Grand Bahama. Now.
Grand Bahama. It stayed over for about 3 days.
Yes.
Now, the majority of the damage took place between New Providence and Andros.
Yes.
What about the other islands in the northwest Bahamas?
They also had some damage, but not as significant as Andros and New Providence. But they had, for example, Abaco. I think there was a boat that was called the Wisconsin Bridge in Abaco, and that was caught in a storm near Abaco, and 34 persons died in that ship.
Mm.
So, and many of them had like Abaco I think had like 120 mile per hour winds, and Grand Bahama reported like I think 90 mile per hour, but not significantly much to impact it in a significant way.
Berry Islands?
Berry Islands were also impacted, but Berry Islands wasn't very much inhabited like it is now.
Okay.
You know, we even today, Mr. Neely, we only have about 2 to 3 weeks at the most of food.
Yeah.
And then at that time, there was probably no food storage.
No.
People were living,
Yes.
I won't say from hand to mouth, but from day to day.
Everything was natural. Yes.
And so the effect on the society must have been extremely dramatic.
Yes. In this one, there's in Andros, there's some of the farmers who they had sheep, they had goat, they had sheep, and they had pigs. They grew pigs.
Yeah.
And before the hurricane, most of them would kill the animals before before the hurricane came and basically
Salted or whatever.
salted wet,
Yeah, yeah.
so that they can, because if they allowed them to stay in, and
They'll drown.
they'll drown. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the remaining portion of the sponging, the beds,
Yes.
were wiped out by 29.
Yes.
Started in 18 something.
Yes. 1866, then it went to 1899. Then you had one in 1924. Then you had the two hurricanes in 1926, which decimated sponge beds as well. And you had two hurricanes in 1926. You had one in 1927. You had two in 1928. You had one in 1929. And 1930, you didn't have any. 1931, you had two. 1933, you had 4 hurricanes, which impacted the Bahamas, and 1 tropical storm. So basically, every year they decimated sponge. And that's one of the reasons why the Bahamas switched from sponging to tourism. Because not only, one of the myths that they say is that the sponge bed was wiped out was wiped out in 1938 by the sponge disease. But before then, a lot of the boats were destroyed. Imagine 336, those boats were expensive. It took them years to save money for a schooner. And most of them were owned by the Greeks, and a lot of vessels were destroyed. So every year you had to rebuild boats and your homes. So it was very inexpensive venture. So they decided, say, look, these hurricanes are too deadly. We think we need to switch to something more like tourism, which would have less an impact on the country itself.
You know, at that time, Mangrove Key was the second largest
Yes.
population center in the Bahamas.
Yes.
Now, today, Mangrove Key is a shadow of itself. Was there a great deal of migration to the U.S. after the hurricane?
Yes, and in the 1920s there was a great deal of migration, and the book that I'm writing on, the 28 hurricane, which is due out in 1st of June, 1,034 Bahamians died that migrated from the Bahamas to Florida in this storm, and 1,034 Bahamians died.
In Florida?
Yes, and it's the deadliest hurricane that we had on record in terms of Bahamians.
Okay, let's take this break here on the program. We're Neely, our guest on the program today. When we return, I want to talk a little bit more about global warming.
Okay.
We take this break, we'll come right back.